be speaking with you in a couple minutes. I realize that I have been speaking for the last minute and have been on mute, so I'm going to start again. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. Thank you for joining us. The first two announcements. One is that there are CE credits available for nurses and social work attendees if you pre-registered. And to get those CE credits, you need to fill out the evaluation form at the end, and the credit forms will be emailed within 1 month to everyone who was pre-registered and fills out the evaluation. We'll remind you about the evaluation form at the end. So I'm Dale Lupu. I'm a faculty member at George Washington University. I've spent my career in trying to develop hospice and palliative care services nationally, make them available, more widely accessible and available. And for the past 7 years, I've been involved in bridging palliative care and kidney care so that we make some of the tools and services of palliative care more accessible to patients who have kidney disease. Liz, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, welcome everyone. We are so excited to see you all here today. It looks like we have a big group, so thank you for joining us. I am Liz Anderson. I actually recognize a few names of participants, so hello. I am assistant professor of social work at Western Carolina University, which is in rural Western North Carolina. But I formerly worked as a hospice and palliative care social worker, and I also worked for Mid-Atlantic Renal Coalition as social services director for ESRD Network 5. So like Dale, I have spent most of my career in really thinking about how do we help provide supportive care, palliative care, quality of life to dialysis patients that are suffering towards the end of life. So with that being said, that's what we were hoping to bring some of that to you all today, and kind of integrating that and thinking about how we can really help respond to all the emotional distress that patients and family members and even staff are facing in light of COVID.
So let's take a look at what we're going to try to cover today. We have 3 topics we want to work through today. So one is, these are all kind of approaches to communicating and responding to the heightened emotional state that everyone finds themselves in. And we're going to cover 3 things. One is the response process of acknowledging and responding to anxiety and fear. The second is ways to recognize and bolster that the dialysis center is, for patients who come there for their treatments 3 times a week, really an important sense of stability and routine. And so how do we bolster that? And then the third is, how do we honor the memory of patients who have died? How do we talk to our other patients? And also, how do we talk to them about if a family member has died? What are some ways that in the dialysis center we can respond to that? Next slide, Liz. So I think Liz is going to take you through this, but I want to make one more broad introductory comment, which is just that I don't think we're bringing you, just to acknowledge, I don't think we're bringing you any new magic. I think especially those of you who are social workers that, and nurses too, these are things that you've learned in your formal education or that you've learned through experience. But we feel like it's, especially as the work demands of COVID have exacerbated, put so much pressure on everyone, the demands from home life as well as work life, that it's useful to just be reminded. And we look at this almost like, people are handing you a mask to protect yourself. We're thinking of this as handing you some words, reminding you that here's a way to approach these things, and just having these words at the ready so that you feel like you have the tools to respond to these heightened challenges. So Liz, do you want to dive in?
Yes, I do. But you know what? I think would be really great if we could take a minute to maybe get to know you. So we were wondering if you could just use the chat box and chat in for us what your position is wherever you work. So if you're from a dialysis facility, what your position is there. If you're not from a dialysis facility, tell us where you're from. Just so we kind of get a sense of the audience, and maybe provide just one word for us. We're curious about the emotional reactions that you're dealing with in the unit right now in light of all that is going on. So if you can tell us that things seem about the same, or if you feel like you're dealing with a lot more emotional content or less emotional content, if you would just chat that in the box, that would be outstanding. So seeing a lot of social workers. Awesome. Yay, social workers. A lot more emotional content. Frustrated, isolated. Home therapy unit.
Nursing homes are especially feeling it, yes. Frustration. Social isolation. Frustrated, especially for nursing home patients. Tired of hearing, just fed up, tired of hearing about COVID-19. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm just done with the isolation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Loneliness, anxiety, more than at the start. It's increasing. Mm-hmm. Depression. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And, you know, it's interesting as we sort of move through this pandemic. I mean, here we are almost in September. You know, our response probably has to shift some too. Yeah, don't want to talk about it anymore. Refuse handouts.
Someone says from Portland, frustrated and apathetic. That's the first time I've heard. So that's a real sense of just being so tired out, so worn out, can't even care about it. Okay.
Anxiety. You know, it's easy as I read this list to even think about how that relates personally. That, you know, I've had some moments in the last couple months where I've been with people and afterwards I'm like, oh my gosh, that was like 2 whole hours where we didn't talk about COVID or whatever. So, right, it's hard. Worried about winter. Yes, I just read something about that. So we know we have our work ahead. Okay, thank you all so much. We're going to ask you to be chatting in some more. So that really helps give us a pulse of where things are. We are going to talk next about how do we really respond to anxiety and fear. Understanding that that is part of what patients are often experience, or our colleagues, or even ourselves. And one of the things that I'm reading in the messages is maybe some people are sick of this. And so I think before I even get started, I think it's so important for us to hold space for where people are in the moment. I really come from that client-centered perspective. And so I think all of this is said in light of, you know, build deep relationship with your patients, get to know them, and use that as sort of your guiding light through the rest of this. We really kind of come to the table with the idea that we do need to connect and invite people to talk about things that are difficult. That is in part because we believe that people are experiencing all of these difficult emotions, whether or not we ask them about it or not. If we don't ask them about it, though, if we don't invite that response, then people are often left to deal with that by themselves. So we're going to go over just a couple of ways that you might invite that response or invite that discussion. The second strategy that we're going to talk about is how to acknowledge emotion. One of the things that we know is that oftentimes we have this physiological reaction to emotion. Our bodies feel emotion. And yet at the same time, we are often socialized to deny our emotions starting at a very young age. You know, I think all of us can remember our parents telling us to dry up our tears and put on a happy face. And so what happens, how that translates into something like this, where we're dealing with a pandemic and all kinds of social unrest, et cetera, is that there's this incongruence between your body and sort of your mind. And honestly, helping people acknowledge their emotion and where they are can be healing and allow people to do some of that grief work that they need to do. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. And then really drawing on people's resilience, which I think in light of what you all typed in about like people are feeling apathetic, they're sick of hearing about this, like, you know, we're just over it. I think the resilience piece is an important building block. Okay, hold on. So connecting and inviting responses. So what this is really about to me is helping patients and caregivers know that we can tolerate their very negative emotions or difficult emotions. You know, most of us have been or in this profession, we're helpers and we want to help people get rid of negative emotion. And so our immediate reaction oftentimes is to sort of shut that down. But connecting and inviting people to share their concerns can allow people the opportunity to safely talk about this. We want to make sure that that we're not giving patients this sense unknowingly that we can't tolerate them talking about it. So even in my own hospice work, one of the things that I learned early on was that if a patient was crying and I was giving them a box of tissues, that sometimes I was sort of sending this message like, okay, stop crying, when really people just needed space to cry. And so just having this awareness of your ability to tolerate that negative emotion and and when I say negative, it's not necessarily negative, but that difficult emotion, and letting people know that you can tolerate it and you can handle it. Because again, often unknowingly, we're giving out those signals that we can't. The other piece of that is, and you all might have a different experience now that we're 5-6 months into this, is that oftentimes people don't like to admit that they're upset. That it can be really challenging. A lot of people report that it makes them feel weak to say that they're upset or struggling. And so finding ways to open that up and normalize that experience is really important. And so we've just come up with a couple of words here, to just invite in, like, I just want to hear what's on your mind about COVID. And if you're really sensing that they don't want to talk about COVID, I think really just even leaning into, I just want to hear what's on your mind about what's going on with you today. Some patients have shared that they're really scared about COVID or whatever that sentiment is. Some people are sharing that they're really burned out about this, that they don't, want to talk about this anymore. Tell me where you are. I want to be on the same page with you. So just inviting that discussion and letting them know again that you can tolerate that piece. I think I know what I was going to say earlier. We come into this profession as helpers. We want to fix it. We want to make it better. And yet one of the things that we know is oftentimes what's healing for people is to be able to process it and talk about it. And I'm talking to social workers, so I know you all know that. So I want you all to use this chat feature again before we go through this slide. And I want you to chat in 3 emotional words to describe the current sense in the dialysis unit, but try not to repeat people that are ahead of you. So try to come up with some new words, which means it'll get harder and harder. But just type in 3 words to describe sort of the pulse of the dialysis facility or wherever you work of the emotion. So they need to be emotion words. And just go ahead and we'll kind of read those out as we go. Scared. Yeah. Uneasy, frustrated, lonely. Depressed. Irritated. Powerless. Isolated. Overwhelmed, exhausted. Hopeful.
Burnt.
Mm-hmm.
Hopeless. I'm noticing, Liz, a shift from a couple months ago in the sort of overall emotional tone that people are reporting. Are you noticing that too?
People are tired.
Yeah, there's really it's like they're done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Complete. So past that initial scare and fear, I mean, that probably is still under there. Somebody says fear, hope, but I'm fearful, tired, but the frustration and exhaustion it is more prominent, and loneliness.
Annoyed, craving normality. These are giving me chill bumps.
Uncertain. Tension among staff. Tension.
Longing. I meant to say this early on. Speaking of that longing and craving normality, and other response, missing things they would normally do. You know, I think we are just in this really exceptional time in that the way that we have historically comforted people when they're suffering aren't quite available to us in the same way, right? So, I think we're really programmed to often comfort people through touch or through body language. And that's hard. When this first started happening, I was thinking about like telehealth versus not telehealth. But it's really not that. It's telehealth versus I'm going to talk to you with PPE on and 6 feet apart, right? And we lose some of those skills that we comfort people with that we're hardwired to do from the time we're babies. And so in some ways, that makes this stuff that we're talking about today, the acknowledging emotion, the exercising empathy piece, even more important. That because we can't do things the way that we used to do, it is so important that we allow space for this. Because one of the things that we're hearing from patients and caregivers is that if they can't physically be present with people, the relationship is so important. It's so much more. It's important always, but it's even more important right now. Well, paralyzed, disconnected, inability to move forward.
Weary of wearing masks, yeah.
Right, weary of wearing masks. Yes, you all are dealing with all kinds of things, and those are shifts from where we were to begin with. So, kind of in honor of that, first of all, congratulations on you all's amazing emotional vocabulary. One of the things in social work school, I'm sure some of you remember, is that we try to teach students to broaden their emotional vocabulary and their emotional repertoire, because we understand that that's part of the healing experience, is to sort of know and understand where your emotions are. And when someone can understand where we are emotionally, then that resonates and we have empathy. So at its core, empathy really is about our ability to resonate with the emotional experience someone has. So a lot of times when we talk about empathy, and I see this with social work students, we think that if we praise someone, say, oh, you're doing a great job, I'm so proud of you. Or if we say, I'm really impressed by your ability to come in despite everything else, they'll call that empathy. But that's really not empathy. That is important work, but it's not empathy. Empathy is our ability to resonate and articulate the emotional experience of our clients, of our patients. And there is just tons and tons of literature that supports how patients and, well, all of us people tend to report more readiness and willingness to engage in change behavior and a relief in psychological distress when they encounter another human being that, quote, gets them. So in order to do that, we have to broaden that emotional vocabulary, which is part of the reason why we asked you all to write down those words, just beginning to exercise our ability to resonate with people. I'll ask students sometimes, I'll give them a really difficult case scenario and I'll say, tell me the emotional words. And a lot of people will use some, but repeatedly. So actually they say the average person only has 7 emotional words in their repertoire. And so just really trying to think deeply about the emotional experience of others. So acknowledge and empathize with that emotion and offer an empathetic statement. So here you can see, I've just given an example. It sounds like you have been fearful, and so fear is that emotional word, about what might happen to you and your family. There's a lot of unknown right now and everything is changing fast. So you can see this statement has nothing to do with my judgment or opinion of a person. I'm just reflecting back what I'm experiencing from my connection with them.
And I would jump in that if we were to make an empathic statement for the group mind that got expressed in the chat, it would be something about, sounds like you are just completely fed up and things aren't changing fast enough.
Right. Yes. And not an empathetic statement that I'm about to make, but a strengths perspective. You all are showing up in here and trying really hard to do better, like to find a way. And so just strengths perspective statement right now, I am impressed given that that is the emotional context of what you're dealing with. So thank you. And then the last point I'm going to make, and I had to toss it back over to Dale, is just how important it is to foster resilience right now. You know, one of the things that I really love to do is to tell people what to do. And yet, unfortunately, I've learned that is so not effective at all. And one of the best ways that we can get people to really change behavior is to help draw upon what has worked for them in the past. And that's also using that strengths approach. And so really helping patients tap into what has helped you get through difficult times before. So I will sometimes just say, you know, I'm wondering if you can tell me about another time in your life where you've really struggled. And then after they tell me that, tell me how you got through it. And then what can we learn from that experience that we can apply here? So taking just another minute in your chat, I'd love to hear from you. What are you hearing from patients about what's working for them? Understanding that we're all different. You know, Dale and I had a conversation last week, and she was like, you know, some people say what helps them relieve stress is to go into the garage and tool around on their car, and that would be awful for me, and I agree. So what are you hearing that patients are doing that is effectively helping them cope through this? Gardening, faith, prayer, exercise, avoiding news, yes.
Mm-hmm. Faith, connecting with family members. Mm-hmm. Trying new recipes, gardening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nature.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Scheduling a time to meet with family members and have it on the schedule. I think scheduling is smart.
Funny movies, yep. One day at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Try not to think about the future too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Coming to treatment makes them feel normal. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Music. Mm-hmm.
Genealogy.
Oh, wow.
Sitting on the porch. Yeah.
Gratefulness. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Worrying about people who aren't taking it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a whole nother.
Mm-hmm.
Looking forward to dialysis. Wow. That is kind of mind-blowing if you think
Wonderful.
about it. Mm-hmm. Pets.
Mm-hmm. And of course, what's difficult is when people can't access these things, like, you know, the nursing home patients who cannot, you know, the therapy dog that they were looking forward to can't come now, or, yeah.
So, right. You know, I think finding a way, if at all possible, and I give this example in my hospice days. I remember we had a patient who wanted so bad to go to the beach before they died, and we weren't able to make that happen, but we were able to get like a small grant and pay for a CD that had, you know, a sound of waves in it. And we brought in sand and seashells, and, you know, it wasn't perfect, but we tried to replicate that peaceful environment in the same way. So yeah, that we're being asked to draw upon a whole new skill set this go round. Yes. Cooking and eating, drinking a bunch. Yeah. Um,
Playing bingo at dialysis. Nice. Okay.
mhm,
So I see a couple people saying that the dialysis center is a source of connection and
mhm.
social connection and normalcy. Yeah. Uh, so that's what we were going to talk about.
Mhm.
So you guys all said this in the chat, so we can go to the next slide, because the question is how to do this in the midst of, now they can't eat, now they can't do this, now they can't do that, now they have to change their chair, whatever. So I think there are two, again, you probably know this, but just to highlight it, there are two suggestions we would make. Well, one is maintain routine when possible. Um, the second is prepare people for the changes. So, and again, acknowledging that things, especially at the beginning, remember the CDC would say one thing and then in the next day it was something else. And that's going to continue to happen. As we learn more, there will be changes. And, as a vaccine comes around, how will that change things? So just acknowledging that you as staff are trying to respond to the changes, to keep them safe, to keep everybody safe, but it's hard. And the next thing, we don't have it on the slide, but the thing to do with that is whenever you can, give people a choice within that change. So, if you're changing people's chairs around, can you ask, it's not always possible, but if it's possible, would you prefer the one closer to the bathroom or the one by the window? And when people resist a change, I think the other thing is, if you can explore with them, not just naming, wow, this change is hard, but if you can explore, what is it that they are wanting to hang on to, and sometimes it can be something you didn't think about and that you will be able to meet for them. So, for instance, somebody who just is really upset that their chair changed, maybe it was because they were sitting next to somebody they want to be with, or maybe they're concerned that they're not going to get the familiar tech, or maybe they wanted to be near the bathroom. So finding out what it is that really has somebody upset is a way to then see if you can negotiate or offer some options, knowing that it may not even be the second choice for them, but can we work in a way that will help you? So, some people really have relied on some eating and drinking during dialysis sessions to pass the time so that they're not bored. But finding out, what is it that's doing for them? And is there a way to help with a second or third choice on that? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so our third topic, we want to move into honoring the memory of patients who have died, and also, again, we've been hearing some sad stories, not just of patients who have died, but of their family members, and how do you acknowledge that? So we'll talk about that, but I want to first acknowledge that this has not been a common part of the culture in many dialysis centers. There have been concerns. First of all, people say, there's a HIPAA concern. Second, people are just worried that you will scare the other patients. So the concern is, if we have a memorial board and somebody comes in and looks at that and sees that their friend died, are they going to think I'm next? Well, yeah, they might. But if they think I'm next, they're going to think that anyway. And if no one has acknowledged that Mrs. Smith died, they're going to think I'm next and nobody cares, which is really different than, wow, I might be next, but people are going to hold my memory dear. It's a very different place to be. And especially those of you who are saying that people have found their faith to be a source of strength, that tells you how much that frame that we have can be a place that we draw strength from. And so for many people, thinking about sort of seeing how other people's legacies and memories are honored can be comforting when they are thinking about their own mortality. And then rituals can help us with that. And we'll talk about a few rituals that dialysis centers have developed. Let's go, Liz. I think you're gonna, was I doing this slide? I think I was doing it. I think I talked about it already. But just that sort of that conspiracy of silence, again, this leaves people, if we don't talk about it, it leaves people alone in their grief, which is a very difficult, in the middle of all of this other isolation, is a very difficult place to be. And just knowing that people are already, they're reading the news, I mean, maybe they've dialed it back, but they know that many, many people have died. They know people have died in their communities. They may have experienced this in their families. They may have seen the people in the dialysis unit who have died. And they know it. They're already thinking about it. And one of the things we've heard reported is by other dialysis centers is that there's been more openness to talking about it. That's been one of the effects of COVID, is that people are no longer ignoring or pretending that mortality doesn't exist, that there's been an uptick in people getting their advance directives done. I have a lawyer friend who said he's just so busy because everybody's coming to make sure their affairs are in order. So that's a response to, yeah, mortality is a real part of the human condition. Next slide. So I've said this, a fear, we are afraid of dying. We are afraid of our life ending. For most people, that's a normal reaction. We're also afraid of being forgotten. And so if we have practices in the dialysis center that, again, respectfully remember people's legacies, what they've contributed, that can be a comfort to the living. Next one. So Liz, I think you're going to model some of this difficult conversation.
So one of the things that I want to say before I go over this slide is I just can't emphasize enough how important your presence is. We're going to talk about words, and words are also really important, but more important is your presence. And so I think a lot of times what happens is we as clinicians actually avoid what we don't know how to do. So if we don't know what the words are, we don't, address it. And I would just say, remembering that you can just hold space for people is so valuable. I go back to attachment theory and what we've learned from, all the people before us in the psychological literature is that, we are, again, hardwired to comfort people through presence. And if you think about, we just know when a baby cries that we hold them next to us, and we acknowledge that piece. And so being with people and holding presence is hands down the most important thing that we can do. Second to that, what we can do is just use our language. And so, I know, and we've heard from lots of people that there can be challenges to talking about deaths in dialysis units, but if at all possible, being able to communicate that with patients, just like Dale said, is so important, because it actually gives a culture of transparency and honesty and care and concern. When we can be transparent, we're communicating that we care, and it helps people feel safe, and it decreases emotional distress. So statements like the following, here, just, we're like family here. I have some difficult news to share with you. Given how much I care about each of you, I wanted to tell you myself that unfortunately Mrs. Smith has died. There's no easy way to deliver that, but just that honest, with pause, words is important. And then, after that, really do pause and allow people that opportunity to respond. Name the emotion that you think that they're experiencing to demonstrate that you get it, so there is that emotional resonance. The second statement after that is, this is really heartbreaking for me or for you. It's okay to be upset or even angry. We are here to support you and listen. And we may not have the answers, but we're in this together. One of the things in some of my own research and talking to patients that have kidney disease, so I've interviewed a lot of patients or caregivers about how they want to have really serious illness conversations, which is a little bit different than this. But what I hear over and over again is that people say, if you're going to have a difficult conversation with me, I want to have a relationship with you. I want to feel like you care. And I don't really care if you don't have the answers. I'd rather you just be honest with me. And so I think that carries over here, just that honesty of I care, I want to help you, I can tolerate it, I'm in this with you, is really important. I also think that as we talk about these things, it's so important to also reflect on, of course, what we're asking you to do is really heavy too. That you, like all the rest of us, are living, breathing, and experiencing what it's like to live in a pandemic. And many of you are probably juggling with children and spouses out of jobs and, all kinds of things. There's all this civil unrest happening that, we all experience or listen to in the news. And so in order to go and do this work and be present for patients, we have to also take really good care of ourselves. And I know that often feels like something that's really selfish. I think if I go for a 20-minute walk this morning, that's 20 minutes that I, could be making sure that, the house is clean for my kids to have good school or whatever. And yet, actually, if I do 20 minutes, I'm going to be a much more pleasant person to work with. And when things happen today, I'm going to be able to deal with them better because I took some time to take care of myself. And self-care goes beyond that. It goes also to making sure we have adequate supervision and support and processing on that as well. So what about how do we respond if a patient's family member has died? Likewise, I think just we have to acknowledge it. We acknowledge the elephant in the room. From my bereavement coordinator days, one of the things I remember was just how important it was for people who had lost a loved one to hear their loved one named. Dale has reminded me that that's not always culturally appropriate. So we do assume that you know your culture and know what is appropriate. But for the most part, people want to know that their loved one is honored. Okay, sorry, I just saw a chat. In doing that, if we have a loved one that has, or have a patient that's had a loved one die, just saying, using their name, I'm so sorry to hear about Linda, and then trying to articulate something that you remember or like about that person that died. So, they had the most cheerful smile. I could tell that James loved you. We're really going to miss the way Thomas joked with us. So really personalizing that message is important. And again, going back to that pause and containment and letting people respond. One of the things that we know is if we plow through the conversation, and again, you social workers are probably familiar with this, that sometimes we prevent people from being able to really express themselves. So going slow, keeping their pace of the conversation slow, allowing people the opportunity to respond and helping name that emotion. This is so heartbreaking and a great loss for you to bear. So name that. And then last but not least, as we've already talked about, letting them know that you can tolerate the emotion. Something like this can make a person so overwhelmed, angry, and devastated. You are safe to talk about any of that with me. And then you can also add, and if we find out that you need more support, I'm here to help you find that. So the final piece of this is just recognizing how important it is, again, to be present. That your presence is by far the most important thing over your precise words. It is really hard to sit with people when they're suffering, but it's also really hard for patients to experience this alone. One of the stories that I like to tell that I learned from the interviews that I did with patients last summer was I was interviewing a man, and I was asking about serious illness, like how would you want to be communicated with if your wife were seriously ill? And we had a great 1-hour conversation, and at the very end he said to me, I forgot to tell you something, that every morning my wife has to go to the dialysis. She wakes up in tears and she says she doesn't want to go, that she's just going to die anyway. And he starts to cry. And drawing on just human compassion, I just acknowledged how hard that was. And I said, who do you have to support you in this? Who can you talk to about this? And in his tears, he said, in the 3 years that she's been on dialysis, this is the longest I've ever talked to anybody. And that really sat with me because, 3 times a week he was hearing his wife say, I'm going to die. And he hadn't really been able to talk about that at all. And so I think, again, just allowing people the space to say that. We don't always have to have a solution with a big red bow, but letting people be heard is so important to the human condition. So sitting with patients through that, and knowing that you're here for them is just enough. And then last but not least, I think we've already kind of been over this. I'm not going to go over the do's because we've already done that. But, just in these conversations, remembering that you do not have to fix this. There are times that fixing is really important, but when we're talking about grief and emotion, actually remembering that listening and being present is a fix. That is fixing it. Listening and being present and holding space is the fix. Discouraging emotion is not usually healthy. Persuading is not healthy. Just really, again, not being present. All right.
So we have some people in the chat asking, what about HIPAA? What about HIPAA? And do you do this on your rounds? And so we'll talk about that in a minute. I also want to acknowledge that I thought that when you chatted in that everyone could see the chat, but I think they only come to us panelists. So I want to apologize because I think, Liz, we both thought everyone could read the chats as they were coming in.
Oh, right.
Apparently you can't. So I'm sorry. We thought you were all getting to see those wonderful lists of emotion words and people's experiences. So we were picking out some to read, but we weren't reading all of them. So we're going to get to the HIPAA questions in a minute. Here are some things that we've heard and seen in other dialysis centers as ways to acknowledge practices. And if, somebody says they can see some of the responses. Okay. So if you would chat in other things that you do, or even if there's some of these, how do you deal with acknowledging a patient who has died? One of the great suggestions we heard when we gave this webinar last week was one social worker said that their HIPAA form at their facility specifically allows patients to give permission for sharing information, like sharing in birthday celebrations and also information about their death. So I don't want to give you HIPAA legal advice. What I am going to suggest is that you talk with your HIPAA compliance person and think about some ways that you can do these practices in a HIPAA compliant way. So if one person had chatted in, somebody says we leave a single white rose in the lobby, nice. Someone says I've done all of these at different clinics, wonderful. Yes, once the obituary is public, we light an electric candle in the lobby. Next to your obituary in our lobby, great. We call the primary caregiver and express sympathies directly. Since we don't usually see the person once patient has died, we send a bereavement card from staff. Once the obituary is public, we put up a purple wreath with their name in the lobby, wonderful. The network utilizes a health status release form that allows patients to give consent to release information. If they pass, go to the hospital, get transplanted, yes. We also light an electric lantern and the person's first name and send the family a card, wonderful. Keep chatting. Which are these satisfactory? What are the problems? So those of you who are having HIPAA issues, yes, once the obituary is public, you can certainly do that. And this suggestion of getting it into the HIPAA form so that you have permission just seems really important to do. And I would say if you don't do an annual kind of memorial service, that you could work with the hospice or hospital chaplain in your community. They're wonderful at figuring out non-denominational kind of celebrations of life that are very healing and give a lot of closure, and a closure for staff as well. Someone says sending notes to surviving spouse with our memories. Yes, and when you send bereavement cards and notes, I'm assuming that you're also experiencing that those are healing for you and give you a closure as staff, which is important too. To not just have this patient you've cared for 10 years just disappear, but you also get to say, thank you for trusting us with your care. Someone says patients really like it. Patients want us to post their funeral viewing information. We live in a very small island, so a small community. When I worked as a bereavement counselor, I had semi-annual memorial services. I'm trying to figure out how to do that in the dialysis setting. Yes, how to do that in the dialysis setting. Important to do. And I would say, as I said, I think brainstorm with a hospice chaplain or hospital chaplain in your area about how to do it. Let's move on. So we have, and these slides will be shared, we have just a few tips about, or places to go for resources on tips on communicating about these emotion-laden subjects. The Vital Talk COVID-ready communication skills, they created what they call a playbook. They did this, actually they took Google suggestions, and it's really a wonderful document that gives you suggested words in various situations. And of course, as Liz said, we're not trying to script you. You're going to find your own words, but it's to get you over that hump when you just don't. I can't find any words. So if you have a few in your toolkit, you can get started and then begin to find your own words. Then SWIPN, the Social Work, Hospice, and Palliative Care Network, has also posted a good document, and the Field Manual for Palliative Care and the Humanitarian Crisis, which is long but has some good suggestions in it. So someone has said, we did an annual memorial service and are currently trying to figure out what to do. Some patients don't like the lantern name. They say that it feels like putting in their face, so most pay close attention. So, I would talk with the person who says they don't like it, and get some thoughts from them. Maybe you move it a little. Maybe you just acknowledge, yeah, it's tough to be faced with the loss of someone in our community. There are going to be people who just don't want to be reminded. So we have a few minutes left, and I think what we would be open to at this point is your questions. What if this helped? So if somebody says, we only post for 1 week so that patients that feel uncomfortable know it won't be up for always. That's a nice compromise. So what would you like, what are you struggling with? What would you like to explore? What are your questions for us?
Mask fatigue.
Oh, mask fatigue, right. Right, right. And we've heard, especially from the network folks, just the increase in anger and confrontation. And that can need some additional skills. When we're talking here, I think we're talking about dealing with kind of the anxiety and grief. When it moves into anger, one of the most important things you can do is stay calm yourself, which can be difficult.
Mm-hmm. I will say, just to respond to that from my experience, I find with those kind of things, using motivational interviewing as really helpful and helping people. One of the skills of motivational interviewing is that ability to help people recognize their ambivalence. And so sort of eliciting from them, like, tell me, what is it that you hate about your mask? And then on the flip side, okay, can you, what might be some benefits to that? And then, helping people see that they might be living in two places at once generally gets people on the road to change behavior rather than you lecturing them. And so that would be what I would do with mask fatigue. But yes, networks would be able to help with that.
So
go ahead, Dale.
Someone has chatted that they would like us to talk about end-of-life issues for those patients considering terminating dialysis. You want to talk about that, Liz?
Sure. Well, I think Dale and I could probably talk for about a week about that. Yeah. And I'm assuming that you mean sort of in this new COVID environment. I think the one thing that I would suggest is certainly the Coalition of Supportive Care Kidney Patients has a ton of really good resources there to help you as a clinician dealing with some of those. But I think the most important piece would be, again, just leaning into that discomfort and having an honest conversation, asking people, where do they think they are with their health, and listening and eliciting a lot of what their concerns are. And that I don't know explicitly what the question might be. I don't know, Dale.
Yeah, you want to say more, if you want to chat in more specifically what's there. The next question was time. There just doesn't seem to be sufficient time to spend with patients. Oh my gosh. I mean, if we could do one thing to help all of us, it would probably be, if any of you are Harry Potter fans, to have that magic time turner, be able to have double our time. But, somebody earlier on had said that they had a lot of frustration because they were spending so much of their day doing the check-ins at the door. And yet, and there's the pressure to get people in quickly, I get it. And yet that is also an opportunity to connect with every single patient coming in the door. So Liz, what are your time stretching techniques?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that you have to do is, which is hard, is I think advocating for more time for yourself. If we want to be able to effectively respond to patients, then we do have to, be willing, we have to have time to build those relationship skills. And so I think being able to talk about what the evidence says about that, and there is quite a bit of evidence. But I think the other thing is to remember, kind of as Dale alluded to, that when we invest the time up front, that often we don't have fires later on. And so it might feel like that we're front loading a lot of time, but hopefully that means on the back end that we're not putting out fires as well.
And what about sort of, Liz, what about, I'm saying, like, I wish I had more time to talk to you about this now.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
But it's such, there's a crisis going on today or whatever. But let's schedule a time. Like, does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So acknowledge, you can even, do an empathetic statement. I know that it is really frustrating to feel like you can't express what you need to right now. And what you need to tell me is really important, and I want to hear that. Let's schedule a time to make that happen. And literally scheduling that time, I think, is important. But again, acknowledging it and leaning into it without also bashing your organization, which I know sometimes we have a tendency to do. Because, and I say don't bash the organization, because generally that just makes patients feel a whole lot worse. And so just saying, this is important to me, you're important to me, this is a crazy time, I care about you, here's what we can do.
And the one other thing I would say, and I'm moved to say it because I'm feeling it right now. Liz talked about how we're hardwired for touch, for human presence, and we don't have that with you guys right now. Mm-hmm. So again, just using, this is where people talked about faith, but I would also talk about imagination. So I want you to just imagine that we have been physically together in a room together, and we're now sort of shaking hands, hugging old friends. Some of you are inviting somebody out to go for lunch. Just imagine that kind of lovely social time that we might close this with. And remember that you can suggest that to patients as well. Imagine that I don't have on all this PPE and I'm sitting right next to you holding your hand. That's what I wish I could do. I'm imagining it. And we know that our imaginations are so powerful that you can get some of the same kind of rush of helpful brain chemicals just by imagining it. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your participation in the chat. Let me remind you that both for your CE, there'll be an evaluation form at the end. When you exit, you need to click on the continue button to take you to an evaluation form. To receive your CE credit, you need to complete that short evaluation. But also for Liz and I, and for Network 5 that's bringing this to you, and for our funder, Picori, but really for Liz and me, it's so helpful to have the evaluations. Give us some comments about what worked, what didn't work, what you would like more of. Thank you so much for being with us. I do so wish we were in a room together.
I do too. And agree. I think Kelly Brooks has shared that the Kidney Supportive Care website that we were referring to, that has lots of information, and the slides and recording will be available. And she has uploaded the website for that.
Yeah. So thank you so much. We appreciate that you took your time during this very, very busy time. And we hope that this sort of bolstered you and sends you back out to deal with the next challenges, and that you tapped in a little to your own resilience and skills. Thank you.
Thank you all.